Yeah, it changed immensely in just a year's time. I've been driving through America with a car for many, many years on every visit. And in the past, people rarely knew anything about what's happening in South Africa. Now, if you stop at a filling station, a petrol
Yeah,
station, or like they say, a gas station here in
yeah.
America, and you buy a cool drink, people will talk to you about farm murders. They're all aware of that. They're all aware of Kill the Boer, what Malema sang. Every single American knows about that.
My guest is Jaco Kleynhans, the Solidarity Movement's head of international relations, who finds himself in the United States of America at this moment as we're speaking here today. You were invited to address the Mackinac Republican Leadership Conference in Michigan. Why did they invite you, and what did you tell them?
Yes, yeah, it's not. It's a very interesting story. This is a very old conference, the first one that took place already in the 1950s, biennial leadership conference. It's the initiative of the Michigan Republican Party. But there's Republican leaders from all over America that attend this conference, about 1,500 people, many members of the US Congress, but also just normal people from all over America that are in some way involved in politics and political mobilization. Now, I've been privileged to travel to Michigan many times over the last few years to meet with many members of the legislature in Michigan. The capital of Michigan is Lansing. There I've met at the Capitol building with many of these people, and I became friends with many of them, including a senator, Jim Ronstadt, who then last year became the chairman of the Michigan Republican Party. And he has an interest in South Africa, what's happening in South Africa. He became aware already last year about things like farm murders. That was for him very bothering. And he invited me then to address this conference, Republican conference, to tell about South Africa, what's happening in South Africa, but specifically with a policy focus in terms of how this fit in with global politics. Why is South Africa important in terms of global politics? Because that is something that people do ask you from time to time. South Africa
Yeah.
is not the biggest economy in the world anymore. We've never been, but we're not that important economically. We're far away from the big levers of power in the world geographically. But South Africa is an important role player in the sense that the way that South Africa will go in future may also determine greater geopolitical shifts in the world. And I think in that sense, people find what's happening in South Africa very fascinating.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about South Africa's why South Africa is of interest to the Americans, but I would like to know that in this geopolitical shifting world, what would
Yeah.
you say would be the key reasons why the USA need to, for their own sake, keep a good relationship with South Africa? What's in it for the
Yeah.
USA in terms of this whole geopolitical shift? What do we offer them?
Yes, I think South Africa is still the gateway to the rest of Africa. If you talk to American companies, which I do regularly, they do believe, despite everything that happened in terms of weakening infrastructure, corruption, and other challenges in South Africa, that the best way to do business in Africa is still from South Africa. That is why 600 American companies do business in South Africa with a very strong focus mostly in expanding their African footprint. Now, the reality is that Africa as a continent is still experiencing a population population boom. By 2050, a quarter of the world population will live on the African continent. Last year, we saw that 14 of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world were on the African continent. And if America, which is the biggest economy in the world, the American companies that want to expand their footprint in the rest of the world, if they want to do that in Africa, they cannot turn their backs
Yeah.
on South Africa. So that's the economic argument. But there's also a very important other argument, and that is that South Africa stands in an interesting way, and we're not the only example, there's a few others also, but we stand in an interesting way somewhere between the West, democratic, you can say even liberal democratic, pro-freedom kind of countries. That's not only Western countries, also countries like Japan and South Korea and so forth, and a block of more authoritarian countries that become stronger, with China leading that block. And we do see the influence in Africa, how these power players and this power struggle is also playing out in Africa. And the way that South Africa will go in terms of this relations can have an important influence in geopolitics. That is something that is clearly an American political strategy, is to try and weaken Chinese influence in the world. So I think they look at South Africa as an important example of a developing country in Africa, but that is still economically strong, has still very strong economic ties with the West and with the democratic world. And they say, we don't want to lose this country. If we lose South Africa, then more will follow that same way. And I'm referring now to even countries in South America, the Middle East, and many other places.
Let's get back to your visit. Can you give us an idea of your itinerary? You've obviously been to this Republican conference. Give us an idea of where you've been so far and what other major states or cities you may visit. And also, if you want to name drop some name dropping, who are you still going to see and who have you seen?
Yes, so at the Republican Leadership Conference, right there in the north of Michigan, I had the privilege to address that conference, talk about South Africa, and then also meet with many Republican leaders. Interesting enough, someone like John James. He's an African American Republican Congress member from the northern suburbs of Detroit. He served in Washington, D.C. in the House for quite a number of years now. He was for some time the chairman of the African Subcommittee in the Foreign Relations Committee. He's still a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. Very important role player. And for interest's sake, I mean, there was quite a focus since January on this relationship between South Africa and the US. But John James started a review process on this relationship already in 2022. That's when he first proposed that. 2023, there were many steps taken by him and his office. So I had to meet with him, with other members of Congress. I think of someone like Tom Barrett, who's on the International Trade Committee, to talk about trade. Trade is, like you've said, one of our main focuses on this visit. So the Michigan trip was very important from a political liaison standpoint. We are also, as Solidarity, kicking off a broader fundraising campaign for specific projects in South Africa, and that kicked off in Michigan. We will broaden that whole focus over the next few months. We've created an organization here in America, our own organization that's registered with bank accounts and all of that. We then went on to Washington, D.C., where I've spent about a week, 2 meetings at the White House, meeting at the State Department, members of Congress on the Senate and the House side, think tanks that are involved in developing policy also about South Africa. And you know what is interesting that people don't always maybe know or understand, because people are asking this question, but why this focus on South Africa? Now, we've discussed some of those reasons. But interestingly enough, is there's quite a number of people working in the Trump administration who have some link to South Africa. Now, that is by coincidence, that's not no one planned that to be the case, but you do have now people in important policy positions in the White House, State Department, and in other places who either grew up in South Africa or at one time lived in South Africa or know people with links to South Africa, and that make it a fascinating time
Yeah.
currently, because what they did over the last few months is they put South Africa very high on the foreign relations agenda in Washington, so
Yeah.
that was very interesting. Yeah, so I had great meetings. I had the privilege to be in the Oval Office, not meeting with Donald Trump, but I stood in the Oval Office for the first time in my life. It is a fascinating room. It's a fascinating place. It's an important room where very important things over many decades happened. Um, After Washington, we traveled to Texas, and here in Texas, there's many different meetings. We have a strong focus on a resolution in the Texas legislature about South Africa, about Afrikaners, about trade between Texas and South Africa. Discuss that with members of the Texas legislature, very, very important. At meetings with South Africans living here, that's part of what Solidarity is doing. We're trying to organize the diaspora, the South African diaspora in America, and then also meeting with many business people. There's also a fascinating thing that we still need to formally announce in the media, but we are signing agreements with American companies to employ South Africans. You will not be because we are in essence, opposed to immigration. We don't say that people must not immigrate. If people want to immigrate, they can, but we want people to stay in South Africa. We don't want highly skilled, experienced people to leave our country, but we do also understand that many people can't find jobs in South Africa and that there's a great job shortage here, or a shortage in skills here in America. So we sign agreements here with companies to employ South Africans, but that they can work remotely from South Africa. So that's some of the focus here in DC. I still need to go to South Carolina, back to Washington, DC for one further meeting, one meeting in New York, and then next week, two final meetings in Michigan.
Yeah, yeah. Now, Jaco, we've all seen the photograph of you in the briefing room. Great
Yeah.
photograph, I must say. You just mentioned the Oval Office. I hope that you take I would imagine you'd also would take a picture in the Oval Office, but be it as it may. Um, the question in my mind when I saw you at the podium of the briefing room in the White House was, why would the doors of the White House go open to solidarity? And I would imagine, unless to, it will appear, Cyril Ramaphosa. And let me qualify my question. Why would the White House open its doors to a movement that really represent only roughly about 6% of South Africa's unionized workers, as opposed to bigger organizations? And once again, why would it be less open to Ramaphosa?
Yeah. Well, on President Ramaphosa, I must comment on that. In that sense, I think it is, in a sense, sad the state of South Africa's diplomatic service at the moment and our diplomatic relations. President Ramaphosa requested a meeting with President Trump at the UN. That didn't happen, but they created the perception in the South African media that it will happen. I can also tell you I was at the State Department, and Minister or the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, declined to meet at the UN with Minister Ronald Lamola, and Mr. Lamola had to meet with the Deputy Secretary of State. So the Americans are sending a message to South Africa. We haven't appointed an ambassador. We've been without an ambassador in Washington now for more than 6 months. Our diplomatic service is at a really low point. There was different government delegations in Washington over the last 2 weeks. They don't speak from the same position. They don't have the same mandate. They clearly don't have a clear mandate on what they can negotiate about. So there's there's a very low level of trust within the Trump administration at the moment towards the South African government. That became very clear. I've met with all those people. I've met with a person second in charge at the State Department, directly working daily with Minister Marco Rubio. So and that's sad. We must all be worried
Yeah.
about that as patriotic people loving South Africa. That's alarming because we have a serious political crisis at the moment in the relationship between the two countries. Why solidarity? There's a few reasons. In the first place, I've been doing this for 21 years. I came to America in 2004 for the first time. Many of the people that I've met in February 2004 at a conference, and they were all like me then, very young, in their early 20s. Those people now work in the White House. They work at the Heritage Foundation. They work at the State Department. They are in important positions in Congress, at the Foreign Relations Committee, someone there. And we've built a relationship over many years with these people. A relationship of trust. When they request information from us, so when I get an email from someone in the White House, like I've received many emails from the White House over the last few months for information, for research, for data, we stop everything that we're doing. Our research department all work together, and within 24 or 48 hours, we produce reports of 30 or 40 pages to the Trump administration on anything from jobs data, crime data, many other things. So we are a credible partner to the Americans. The Americans know they can trust us. What we give to them is credible information. We're there when they want to talk, and we've built this relationship over many years. I think that's a very important point. But there is also, and I must acknowledge that there's a very, very high interest in Afrikaners as a minority in South Africa from Donald Trump that developed over many years. I think there's also quite a wrong perception on how that developed. I know how that developed. It's through a broad network of friends, people close to Donald Trump, people he played golf with, but also friends of him in other places, in New York and in Florida, all with South African links. So he developed a very, very high interest in South Africa, but specifically then Afrikaners. And that opened a window of opportunity for us when Trump came back to the White House.
Yeah, yeah. Jaco, you've just said something now that I think would really peeve off a lot of people within at least the African National Congress government in South Africa. You also said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you get direct requests from the White House to solidarity. I mean, that's quite something. And let me add this here. I didn't do much research, but I saw that you had a meeting with a man called Brendan McNamara, who has previously worked for the US Africa Command. He's joined Trump's National Security Council as Africa Director. These are not unimportant people. These are very serious people that you guys are talking about. My question is partly, is this not risky business as well for you? Because I just see the Minister of Police and the Minister of Foreign Affairs in South Africa sort of expressing their displeasure with your
No,
activities.
yeah, they're very unhappy. Minister Lamola even attacked me directly on X. He quoted one of my tweets, and he quoted that and attacked me. And there's a strange perception that the South African government has a monopoly on foreign relations. That's crazy. I mean, there's no government in the world has a monopoly on foreign relations. If you visit Washington, there's delegations from South Africa every week in Washington. People from different business groups, from different political parties, from different organizations. And that is the case for countries all over the world. There's lobbyists in Washington, hundreds and hundreds of lobbyists. Now we have a principle at Solidarity that we don't work with lobbyists. We've never ever used any lobbyists. We built our own direct relations with people in politics. But yes, interestingly enough, the government is unhappy. I think they must just read again our documents and and they're willing. They can talk to us about that, but they can also talk to anyone that we meet with about our agenda, because they may misunderstand our agenda, because our agenda is not one of in any way damaging South Africa or the relationship between South Africa and the US. It's rather to find ways to fix that. We are not sitting around the table there in the White House and asking the Americans to create larger damage to the South African economy. We're trying to find ways around the current damage in the relationship. Now, we're not a government, so we can't do what governments do, like signing a trade deal with the American government. Solidarity can't do that. But Solidarity can use our relationship and our influence in the Trump administration to ask for lower tariffs and for all kinds of measures to support, for instance, the agricultural sector in South Africa. And they will come. I can promise you today on this program that the Trump administration within the next few weeks will make an announcement on support for certain industries in South Africa. That's the kind of things that I've worked on the last 2 weeks here in America, not about trying to destabilize South Africa or even make it more difficult for the South African government to work with America. What is interesting, we've reached out twice to President Ramaphosa directly and asked him to work together, that we and the South African government and business must work together to approach the American government. There were people in the ANC who tried to facilitate that. There were people in business in South Africa who tried to facilitate that. But people in the government decided they're not going to work with us. Now, I'm not then going to sit back and see how 30% tariffs destroy the livelihoods of many South Africans. So, yeah, it's a dangerous business. We get threats all of the time, but we can't sit idle and wait for this situation just to play out by itself.
Yeah, yeah. Your words, you say the White House is clearly frustrated with the South African government. Concluding a trade agreement is within reach, you say, but the South African government lacks the political will. Now, once again, explain that to me.
Yes.
If you say the South African government, I beg your pardon, is lacking the will, what are you talking about specifically?
Yes, so very important. I think that you mentioned that, but it's very important to reaffirm that is that the Americans want a good relationship with South Africa and they want a trade agreement. That's different from, say, their relationship with Venezuela or Iran or countries like that. They don't want to do business with those countries. They want to do business with South Africa, so they're willing to really give us a good deal. When you say us, South Africa, the Americans are very, very much willing to broaden South Africa's access to the American market, get much more investments from America in the South African economy. And we need that. South Africa lost billions of dollars of foreign direct investments over the last 5-6 years. That's an enormous challenge. If you look at the mining industry, there's nearly no new mines being built in South Africa. The mining infrastructure is old because the foreign investments are pulled out of the South African economy. We don't get new investments. So the Americans look at that and they say, we will put a good deal on the table, but they have a few very simple demands. And those demands were communicated to South Africa in February. It was communicated to President Ramaphosa during his visit in May. It was communicated to Parkstown, Ronald Lamola, all these delegations. First place, they need to know that their property rights will be guaranteed and there will not be expropriation without any compensation. You don't need to scrap the act on that. The president can give certain very basic assurances. That's not so difficult. The second and the third requests are very easy. President Ramaphosa must just say that he must take a person himself as president a strong position against singing of kill the Boers, to say, well, he discouraged that. He don't want people to do that. He's not doing that at the moment. He's sending out other ministers to do that. But we need the president to say, stop with singing kill the Boer. The farmer tax must be declared a priority crime. That's very easy. There's many priority crimes in South Africa. Rhino poaching is a priority crime. Crime in the Cape Flats is a priority crime. Why can't farmer tax be a priority crime? The third thing that they are demanding is that South Africa must affirm that racial laws are not permanent. And we've spoken, the White House had very good questions on that, because South Africa is not acting in accordance with the United Nations at the moment in terms of things like BEE and affirmative action. It's becoming permanent in South Africa, and you're not allowed to have
Yeah.
permanent racial discrimination in any country. So they're
Mhm.
asking for certain exceptions for American companies. And lastly, a neutral foreign policy. South Africa must just affirm that. They don't have to do something. They must affirm to the Americans, listen, yes, we will look again at our foreign policy and try to be more neutral, something that the South Africans didn't do. If South Africa do something on those 5 points, then you can have a very good trade deal.
Yeah, yeah. I want to focus just for one moment on that neutral foreign policy that you're talking about. That would obviously also touch on things like South Africa's participation in BRICS, but Israel, the genocide case at the International Court of Justice, how much of a big chunk is that in terms of
Yeah.
thinking of America? And then I just want to ask you, a month or so ago, I can't remember exactly how long ago, but we saw Justin Lewis, the UK-based consultant and representative for the human rights lobby group, CASISA, they call themselves. I couldn't find anything of CASISA on the internet. They claimed that the African National Congress had prior knowledge about the whole Gaza Hamas event on October the 7th. So the basic question is, how much of a genuine, real factor does that play in the minds of the policymakers? South Africa in bed with, or at the very least, good buddies with
Yeah.
Hamas,
Yeah.
Hezbollah,
Yeah.
Iran. How much does that really play a role?
Yeah, it's one of the four legs that the whole process of reviewing this relationship stand on. So I would say it has at least a 25% influence. It's a major issue. I think Israel, the case against Israel, the Israeli lobby in America contribute about 25% to this crisis of this relationship. Another quarter is the global geopolitics and China. A quarter is what's happening in South Africa and the relationship with Afrikaners. But I think the what happened over the last year or so is that there was a huge campaign in Washington by many pro-Israel groups to put that on the agenda. And you must ask yourself just again, with in any way talking about Gaza and Palestinians and what's happening there, was it in South Africa's best interest to take up that case? Why not another country? Why couldn't other countries do that? Why was South Africa the one who had to take the initiative with that case? Because that really exposed South Africa. We're not the strongest country. Our economy has for 10 years been in a very difficult position. We're not a strong player. We're very dependent on the rest of the world. We really exposed ourselves as a country. So that played an enormous role. There's investigations here in America at the moment being done about the question, did the ANC know beforehand of that attack in October 2023? And then also the question, where I don't have an answer yet, how much money, if any, did the ANC get from places like Iran? For their election campaign last year. I don't know if that's the case, but there's investigations being done on a very high level about that at the moment. So that really weakened South Africa's negotiating position. So I don't think that was a very good move for South Africa. You can always listen to all the moral arguments, but then you must immediately ask, why is the South African president not outspoken about the genocide happening in Sudan at the moment? 200,000 people killed the last 2 years by the rapid support forces. And the South African government is completely silent on that. And I can name many other examples. So if you want to be the moral leader in the world on this, then you need to play a different role. I don't think South Africa just simply has the position currently in the world, the kind of level of being a powerful role player to do that. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It played an immense role. There was a big lobby. There's many members of the US Congress who comes from the Jewish group within Congress, the caucus, Jewish caucus, and they played a big role in pushing this agenda.
My next question really is, how difficult will it be in the future for America and the United States of America and South Africa to find a middle ground here? Because South Africa is not going to stop its support for Hamas. We talk about the African National Congress has had historic relationships with them. I can recall the words of Nelson Mandela, who said, "We will trade with anybody that will serve our interests, and we will never forget our friends that supported us." So it's virtually highly unlikely that the ANC government will pull back on that. Also, South Africa is involved in enroll in BRICS, for example. I could not possibly think of a scenario in which South Africa could tomorrow say, you know what, we're going to turn our back on BRICS. So what I'm talking about here, and that's the same thing with the relationship with Iran, who greatly supported the African National Congress during the struggle days. The same thing with the relationship with Russia, whether we like it or not. This is very deeply ingrained in the DNA of the African National Congress, or at least I would imagine a substantial number of black support in South Africa. So how possible is it, or how do we bridge? How do we close that gap?
Yeah, I think by just much better diplomacy, we must be very honest that South Africa currently don't have people with the right experience implementing our diplomatic and our foreign policy strategy. If you go to DIRCO, the South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation, we have a minister, Lamola, who don't have any experience. He was appointed Minister of Foreign Relations, but he without any experience in foreign relations in a very difficult and complex time in international politics. Now he must sit next to ministers like Rubio, like the Chinese Minister Wang Yi. These are people, the Indian Minister of Foreign Affairs. These are people with decades of experience in foreign relations and geopolitics. So that's a very simple point that I want to make. If you go to DIRCO's office in Pretoria, you look at the people there, it's been hollowed out. We've appointed, the ANC, I must rather say, the ANC government appointed politicians in diplomatic positions for many years. And we don't have experienced policy hawks, people who understand international relations, geopolitics, who worked with that for many years and who do have the contacts. I think that's the first challenge. The second one is simply knowing how to play the game. We don't have to leave BRICS. Indonesia is a BRICS member, and they have very good relations with America. They signed recently a very strong trade agreement with America. Indonesia is also a country with a huge Muslim population. But they play the game around the relations with the Palestinians and what must happen in Gaza in the right way, and they're outspoken towards in favor of rights for the Palestinians, a two-state solution, all of that, without going as far as the kind of extreme rhetoric that came from South Africa and from South African diplomats. So you don't have to turn on your old friends. The ANC don't have to turn on everyone, but they must play a better, safer diplomatic game, which they're not doing. There was a time when we had something of that, and you're absolutely right. I mean, Nelson Mandela had ties with many of these Palestinian organizations, and the Americans were concerned about that, and some Europeans, but at least it was at a level that they could take that, they could say, yeah, we understand this historical relation, but at least you're not working against our interests. What the Americans are saying now, and that's the big difference. They say that South Africa is working against American interests, even American national safety interests. If South Africa in any way support Iran in their nuclear program, then you're endangering American interests in the Middle East. Iran had many, many attacks on Americans over the last few years in the Middle East. So the Americans say, well, you're not only friendly to Iran, they're not your historical buddies, but you're now supporting Iran against America in terms of even national security. Now, then it becomes a real threat. And I can tell you, India is not doing that. Indonesia is not doing that. Brazil is not doing that. Yes, and they're all part of BRICS and they're all friends with many of these nations. But South Africa went too far. South Africa went simply too far in their anti-Americanism, and I think, yeah, it's now at a point where South Africa must either the South African government must ask themselves, will we try to get back to where we were in the 1990s? The late 1990s, is it possible to get back to that place in terms of foreign policy? My fear is that we don't have the people
Yeah.
capacity, the individuals with the capability and the credibility to do that.
When you go about and you just sit around a cafe and have a coffee or a beer or whatever the case might be with your American host, do you talk about, and are the Americans in general terms, they must be aware of this ginormous geopolitical storm change that we are experiencing and going through right now? It's undeniable, the
Yeah,
rise
yeah,
of China as a superpower. Russia has redefined its position in the world and is in the process of doing so. Um, the balance of power have shifted already. Putin calls it a natural evolution. Do people in your vicinity, when you sit around and have that beer, do they talk about this, and how do they evaluate the shifts that have now really been clearly defined and seen by most observers?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's a very, very high level of awareness of this in America, and that is also why it is so interesting that President Donald Trump focused so much of his time on foreign policy. The expectation in January and still early February was that Trump will become a domestic president, that he will focus only on issues like immigration, the role of the federal government in America, energy policy, education, all the issues of a America first, more isolationist, inward focused president at White House, like you saw in many decades before the First World War. Well, exactly the opposite is happening. When you hear from the White House, it's mostly on foreign policy. The number of leaders that visited the White House, I stood there right at the entrance Sunday afternoon at 5, and I think it was 20 hours later, Recep Erdogan stood at the same spot from Turkey, the Turkish president. And that is because President Trump wants to bring an end to the war in Gaza, but he
Yeah.
can only do that if Turkey agrees to his plan. He had to get the Turkish president to agree on that plan, and then a day later, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, was there. So. You see all these world leaders. I mean, everyone probably saw that picture of Trump sitting in the Oval Office with, I think, about nearly 10 European leaders sitting opposite him. That was the most European leaders in history attending one single meeting in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and why is that happening? Why is he spending all that time, all that political capital? Because and I think that's in a sense where people underestimate Donald Trump and the Trump administration because of the way that he speaks and his populism and all of that. But they do understand what you're saying is that the world is shifting, global power relations are shifting, and they see soft spots in Chinese influence. They see that there's generally a worry in many countries in the world that China is dumping Chinese products in markets. We saw that in South Africa with many job losses due to that. That's happening all over Africa. I've heard just in the last week here in America of the concern in Latin American countries. Mexico last week started with very high import duties on many different Chinese products, like Chinese cars. Because what's happening, the Chinese government subsidize Chinese companies so that they can then sell their products at very low prices all over the world. China's strategy to dominate the world is first by doing it by Chinese exports, to make people all over the world dependent on Chinese products and then on Chinese money, and then you can't get out of that grip that the Chinese have on you. We saw that in many African countries. There's some African countries who can't repay their debt to the Chinese, and they're actually controlled by the Chinese. That's the Chinese strategy. So the Americans are looking at that, and they want to find soft spots and then move in. They see that with South Africa, the same. They see that the Chinese influence in South Africa is increasing, but at a cost for South Africa. South Africans are paying a price for Chinese influence, and the Americans want to be an alternative. So yes, you're absolutely right. There's an awareness that the world is changing demographically, economically, but also in terms of power relations. And I think President Donald Trump, interestingly enough, wants to be remembered, and he's working on his legacy. He has 3 years left in the White House. He wants to work on a legacy as being remembered as someone who put America on the right path in terms of a 21st century global order. Well, we will need to see how that play out, but I think we must acknowledge that America is still very strong economically, militarily, and in terms of international influence.
Jaco, the word that must have been used by you the last couple of days, the one word probably obviously is trade agreement,
Yes.
tariffs. Now,
Yeah.
I'm not as smart as you are, and don't know much about how the economy works. But my simple question: what sort of trade, what sort of tariff do you think would be a reasonable, and I would call it a win-win,
Yeah.
to use Trump terms now. And I think that's part of the question, is what would be for the Trump administration, what would be a win-win a tariff, and why does it seem like the Ramaphosa government is not able to achieve
Yeah.
such an agreement?
Yes, so I think that tariff will be one that makes South African products competitive in the American market. We must first acknowledge that the time of zero tariffs is gone. As long as Trump is in the White House, we will not go back to the great position that we had for 25 years of more than 1,000 South African products being exported to America with zero tariffs. That will not happen in the next 3.5 years. Again, so what will be a tariff that will still make South African products competitive? And then you need to look at the tariffs on products from our main competitors. South Africa compete very strongly with South American countries in the American market. Let's take one industry, and remember we have broad exports to America, but take one industry that is simple to explain, and that is agriculture. Our agricultural exports to America include things like citrus, wines, nuts, some other products. And we compete with Chile, Peru, Argentina, Brazil, those countries. Most of them currently have a 15% tariff. We have a 30% tariff. So ours is double theirs at the moment. And that means that South African exports is not competitive at the moment. So by the middle of next year, when we will have big citrus exports to, again, hopefully to America, we can't have a 30% tariff, because then the Americans will rather decide to buy citrus from Chile and Peru EU and these other countries. So I think a 15% tariff is good. That's what we've proposed to the Trump administration. We've asked them to lower it at least on certain industries, like the car manufacturing, the auto industry, textiles, uh, one or two other manufacturing industries, and then agriculture, which is for us as an organization very important. But I think what is also important is to say that our proposal is focused very much on what can be achieved without a trade agreement between South Africa and America. We believe that the South African government is failing at the moment to achieve that trade agreement. Like I've said, there were 2 or 3 different delegations in Washington. They all talk from different positions. I don't think there's a clear mandate that's determined, and that's the problem with the big challenges within the ANC. You know, the tension within the ANC, the different factions, all of that you have there. So that's a big problem. So what can you achieve without a trade agreement? You can get an executive order from the White House to lower tariffs in certain areas. You can have certain plans implemented by the American government to support certain industries that were hit very hard by this tariffs at the moment. So we're working on a number of plans with the Trump administration for the short term, at least, while there's still not a proper trade agreement in place.
I want to go through just a short list of the big headaches that we talk
Yes.
about in South Africa. Just before that, are you also talking to the Americans about the possibility of exonerating US companies from BEE legislation?
Yes.
Is that something that is on the table?
Yes, it is. Absolutely. It's something that's on the table. That's something that the Americans put on the table, and we've included that in our proposals. Now, you can say, why in the world, do you do that? Because what about South African companies? And we say that we believe that can be the beginning of something greater, because we need to start talking about the end of BEE, the phasing out of these racial laws. And we know that if the Americans get that, the Europeans will ask for the same. And at the end, somehow, we can get a phasing out of some of these laws. These laws make it very difficult for American companies to invest in South Africa. There's many American companies who want to invest much more in the South African economy, but BEE laws make it just too expensive for them at the moment. It adds about 30% costs to their business, because they need to get a local BEE partner in South Africa who needs to own 30% of the company, and the cost of all of that just doesn't make sense. And then you get a scenario where American companies open African offices in Kigali, in Rwanda, Nairobi, in Kenya, Dakar, in Senegal. We saw that in the last year or two. I'm alarmed by that. I'm really concerned about that, because I still believe that South Africa is the best place in Africa to do business with from an American perspective. So, yeah, I think that's very strongly part of the proposal.
My next question regarding Black economic empowerment is a little bit more nuanced. I'd like you to tell me, or give me an idea, an impression of how do the Americans view BEE in South Africa. I know we talk about it and we see it as race discrimination. That's one of the arguments in South Africa, but the USA has had its own form of affirmative action for something like 60 years or something like that. I think it started in the Kennedy years. How do they view Black economic empowerment? And I suppose the question at the end of the day, do you fight for the total elimination of these laws, or are we talking about restructuring or rewriting the laws in ways in which it still makes sense to have some form of what the Americans would call affirmative action going into the future in South Africa? So is it an absolute scrapping and get rid of it, or are we saying, you know what, phase it out perhaps, or we can still in certain sectors apply it under the general morality idea of affirmative action?
Yeah, we don't work in a perfect world, Solidarity work with the realities of South Africa, and that's sometimes something that I must remind people of, because I get confronted sometimes by people who say, "Well, why don't you just demand for an end of BEE?" I say, "Well, I work with the reality. We work with other trade unions, organizations. We work with the government. We know that's not possible." So yeah,
Yeah,
we're very much in favor of a phasing out of BEE laws over time, and at least also to prove to the South African population of the benefits, economic benefits, when
yeah,
you phase out BEE laws, because there will be great economic benefits. That's the Americans agree with us on that. The Americans feel very strong about South African BEE laws. In America, it was to the benefit of a small minority.
yeah,
You can't uplift an 80%, 82% majority by
yeah,
BEE laws. It's not possible. So they understand that argument very strongly, and that is why they talk so much about it with their when they negotiate with the South African government. I can confirm that with you. That was very, very much part of the agenda the last 2 3 weeks when they spoke with us, but also when they spoke with the South African government.
yeah. Next one on my list, expropriation without compensation. Obviously, that's on the table as well. I just want to get the US view on that, and and then I would just rephrase it on land reform in South Africa. What is their view on the subject?
Yes, I mean, America is one of the countries in the world with the strongest view on property rights. The whole American dream is built on property rights. Americans will tell you when you talk about the American economic success story, they will tell you, well, the first base of it is property rights. So they're very concerned about the bill that President Ramaphosa signed end of last year on the expropriation without compensation, and they want some kind of assurance that there will not be expropriations with zero compensation. Now, the problem with that is that we saw 2 weeks ago the announcement of the first expropriation process east of Johannesburg, where there will be zero compensation of agricultural land. That process has started. It's the Ekurhuleni municipality who started it. So that's really alarming. The Americans all know about it. They tell us about it. So they're very, very concerned about it. And I think President Ramaphosa need to address this. The problem is he stays silent. His negotiating teams don't talk about it. They don't bring anything to the table. Currently, they have no proposal to the Americans about that. And I can't see a trade agreement happening between the two countries without some kind of assurance on property rights.
Yeah. When we talk about, I want to talk about land reform. I want to talk about it in that context now.
Yeah.
Do the Americans see, understand, acknowledge that there should be something like land reform? What is your story to the Americans that land reform is a done deal? It's already done. It's all okay. It's a headache of the history that we've worked on. Uh, what is the view of solidarity, I guess, to the Americans? Have we done enough in terms of land reform? Are we satisfied where we are at the moment with land reform? And I'm not talking about the extreme guys now, go back colonials and all that
Yeah.
you're starting land kind of nonsense and so on. But what is the realistic picture that you're conveying to the Americans, and how do they respond to it? What is their input on?
Yes. Yes, yes. No, so I think I think there's quite agreement between us, our organizational viewpoint, and the American government on this, and that is, yeah, you can just look at the track record of the last, say, 25 to 30 years. And that is where land reform took place, where successful farms were bought at market value and were given to people with the correct training, access to capital, and with a good relationship with other farmers who have the knowledge. Then you can have successful land reform. If you simply take farms from commercial successful farms and you give it to people without the knowledge, access to capital, the potential to be a commercial farmer, you have all these examples of failed land reform. There's more than 800 examples in South Africa of farms bought by the South African government. They just given to black communities, and yeah, there's nothing left. They just sell off everything on the farms that they can sell off. It becomes completely economically inactive, and that's a great loss in a country where we have a very high population where we need to feed. So I think again, we want to take out the populist kind of rhetoric in terms of land reform and say that it must be easy and easier for black farmers to be successful commercial farmers in South Africa. We want to see more success stories of more successful black commercial farmers being really successful, increasing their capital value. You're not going to do that the way it's been done the last 25 to 30 years. You're simply not going to do that by expropriating land from current farmers, because that will lead to financial crisis in South Africa in the banking sector. It will lead to a credit crisis, to very high inflation. That will destroy the agricultural sector like it happened in Zimbabwe. The Americans are very, very much aware of how things went wrong in Zimbabwe.
Jaco, a little bit my last question, or moving that direction. I know it's early in the morning there, and you've got probably a very busy schedule ahead of you. And thank you very much for this time you're giving me. Farmer tax. I personally have talked to a number of victims of farmer tax lately. I'm personally very deeply touched by this, and I want to do more around this theme as well. So my question is a little bit nuanced. South African government has created the National Rural Safety Strategy. They've not explicitly designated farmer tax as a standalone priority crime. In your view, has government done enough? Are they doing enough? That's part of the question. And the second part of the question is, how do the Americans look at this? I'm sure that you guys must have jubilated when you heard the court results with Julius Malema. But how do the Americans look at it in terms of the words that Trump spoke, the genocide that he talked about some time ago? What is their perception among those of the Republican Party that you sit around the table with? And do they genuinely believe that there's some form of a genocide going on in South Africa? So it's two questions. Really?
Yes. I think the first thing is that what's important is that there was last year less farm murders in South Africa than the year before, not because the government did anything, but because organizations like AfriForum and others do much more. They implement safety strategies in more and more South African communities, train people, activate systems, use technology to better improve the safety in rural areas, help farmers to get the necessary safety training and to implement technology on their farms to improve their own safety. That is why, to be honest with you, we had last year more farm attacks than in 2023, but less murders. People can fight back, and when a farm attack happens, there is a team of trained people who can react quickly. That has nothing to do with anything that the government did. The South African police force don't act on farm attacks. We actually see more and more problems in terms of the immediate reaction after a farm attack, the lack in seriousness that they take in not only that immediate reaction to when a farm attack happens, but also efforts to prosecute farm murderers. That's why more than 70% of the cases, no one is ever prosecuted. So we have a serious problem in terms of the will, the political will, but also the practical will in the police service, in the prosecuting authority, and in government to deal with this problem. I think the Americans are very aware of that. That is fascinating to see how much they are aware of that in terms of what the presidency. You know that we've never referred as Solidarity or AfriForum. We never used the term genocide. I think that what we must understand is that the American president used that word from a different perspective, in a different term. He sees this as a bigger problem of a broad attack on a minority in South Africa who are slowly but surely pushed out. So he sees that in a context of making it more and more difficult for minorities to survive in South Africa. And that's why he used that word. In the South African context, we don't use that word because it has a different meaning, I think, in South Africa. And we just simply talk talk about the realities that we and our members experience. We as the Solidarity Movement, and especially AfriForum, spent millions and millions of rands in trying to improve rural safety. And we hope that the Americans will support us on that. I think there's great proposals at the moment on the table for America to financially also support these efforts.
If I can go back to this question just for one moment, or we'll go a little bit deeper in this, which is when you shake hands for the first time with somebody in America and say, this is Jaco Kleynhans, he's from Solidarity, he's from South Africa. Do the Americans look at you, and is that part of the discussion immediately, the land, the place of the genocide, in the minds of the average American, in the hands that you shake?
Yeah, it changed immensely in just a year's time. I've been driving through America with a car for many, many years on every visit. And in the past, people rarely knew anything about what's happening in South Africa. Now, if you stop at a filling station, a petrol station, or like they say, a gas station here in America, and you buy a cool drink, people will talk to you about farm murders. They're all aware of that. They're all aware of Kill the Boer, what Malema's saying. Every single American knows about that. Last week, I got into an Uber taxi, and the taxi driver was from Turkish descent. He's been living for 5 years in America, in Washington, D.C. And the first thing he asked me, what's your accent? I said, South African. He said, I know about the farmers getting killed in South Africa. That's a Turkish guy living in Washington, D.C. He was really concerned about farmers in South Africa. I think that's great news. There's a very, very high level of awareness now in America. We need to send that energy now in the right direction. It's not only good if people are angry or so. We must get people to become, and the American government to become practically involved in finding solutions.
I'm really out of time. Just very briefly, your visit is post Charlie Kirk, the horror story. Has that changed the character, the mood in the country? Is it something that everybody is talking about still? And
yes. 3 weeks later, people are still talking about it. There's a general fear in America for violence. Americans talk about their fear for more violence in future. They're really worried that it can get out of control, in a place where people just start to use much higher levels of violence. So that's a real concern. I think there's a discussion, a debate here in America about the future of this country. So that's the very negative side. The positive side is that there's a movement amongst young men to send energy in the right direction, because you can have energy really used for a very negative kind of purpose. But there's many organizations, and also like Charlie Kirk's organization, Turning Point USA, who try to channel the energy in a more positive direction. And America has the potential as a country to do the right thing. I think it may go in the right direction. But yes, it's fascinating to see how the death of Charlie Kirk changed the political dialogue in America.
I want to close this discussion with showing the viewers that lovely photograph of Jaco in the briefing room in the White House. Just tell me about that moment,
Yes.
Jaco, and I will let you go and finish your breakfast or do what you need to do.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting that you're not allowed to take pictures in the White House. You must give in your cell phone. And that's the case for anyone. The South African ministers who went with President Ramaphosa in May also had to give in their cell phones. So you're not allowed to take pictures in the Oval Office, except the media. Only the media may take pictures in the White House. But the one place where you are allowed to take pictures is the media briefing room. So I at least got a picture. That's the only picture I got from within the West Wing of the White House, there where all the action is happening. I would have loved a picture in the Oval Office, because that's quite something. But yes, at least I got this picture in the briefing room during my meeting there.
Jaco, your kids must be proud as what a fantastic.
They absolutely enjoy it. Thank you.
Jaco Kleynhans, Head of International Relations for Solidarity Movement. Thank you very much. It's always really a great pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.